This is the You Can Learn Chinese podcast. For everyone who's trying to learn Chinese or reaching for the next level, you came to the right place. I am your host, Jared Turner, longtime resident of China, co-founder of the Mandarin Companion Graded Reader Series, Chinese blogger, and a cow chip throwing champion. My co-host is John Pasden, co-founder of Mandarin Companion, founder of All Set Learning, the Chinese Grammar Wiki, Sinosplice.com, and charter member of the Great Texas Mosquito Festival. In this episode, John and I discuss the secrets of reading fluency in Chinese. Specifically, we'll go through scientific research that helps us to understand what makes a fluent reader. You'll also get a rant and a rave. Guest interview is with Ola Jagielska from Poland, who has learned multiple languages, including Chinese. All this and more, let's get to it. All right, hi John, how are you doing today?
Hey Jared, doing all right. So we couldn't record last week because I had this cold, but I'm doing all right now. I feel like colds are worse and worse in Shanghai. I'm afraid it's because of the air, but
maybe it's the pollution.
Yeah, I'm afraid that's why. But anyway, I'm hanging in there.
All right, well, I'm glad you're with us. I'm glad you are surviving. All right, we have a friend who's a Chinese teacher. His name is Diane Neubauer. She is a very enthusiastic teacher, very active in Chinese education, and she's pursuing a PhD right now. So she clued me into a very interesting research paper. You know, we have a lot of opinions, but it's great sometimes to come across a paper that's really well researched and has some very concrete findings, something that we can share with our listeners.
Okay, so what's the name of the paper and who are the authors?
Okay, so this is called Character Reading Fluency, Word Segmentation Accuracy, and Reading Comprehension in L2 Chinese by Helen Shen from the University of Iowa and Xinjiang from Beijing Language and Culture University.
All right, a little disclaimer here. I'm afraid that talking about a research paper could get boring, so we're going to avoid that. We're gonna cut right to the chase and talk about the interesting parts.
Yeah, absolutely, because going through some of these things, it can put you to sleep. In fact, I think I've nodded off a couple of times.
Okay, so this paper actually did experiments with students. They were first talking about the research into reading fluency in English, and then, of course, Chinese is always a little different. So then they compared with their own experiment how reading fluency works in Chinese. So some of the things that they were looking at were accuracy, can people read the words correctly, and speed, and then comparing context-free readings, which are just lists of words, with context-based readings, which means, the words are in context and you're reading the whole passage. So once you put it in a context, then you can also do reading comprehension questions to measure how well people are actually understanding what they read.
Yeah, I like to compare this as the difference perhaps using flashcards versus reading paragraphs.
Yeah, the context-free is just a list of words. Can you read the word? And then move on to the next word. And so how quickly you can read each word is definitely a factor in your reading fluency.
Now, John, as I was reading this paper, there was something that really stuck out to me, and something I guess I intuitively know, but I didn't really think about before. Now, we all know that Chinese is a difficult language to learn, and the characters, that's one of the most challenging things about the language, and it's also one of the things that gives us the most beauty. But when they're talking here about, reading accuracy, being able to just, recall the word and the speed of it, there was also the other element that they're bringing up, and that's the parsing of the language. That's because, Chinese, there's no spaces in between the characters. They're just all smushed together. And so you have to have enough familiarity with the language to be able to parse it. And so by, separating into different characters and words. Now, I know we do this, but something I didn't quite think about is that how that adds an additional layer of difficulty with the language and learning to read, because you're not just trying to learn the characters and recognize the words, you're also trying to parse them in your head. And it takes more brain processing power to just simply learn how to parse those words.
Right. And one of the things that I thought was really cool about this paper was how they pointed out that act of first identifying characters and then parsing those characters into words that that's not necessarily linear. So you might recognize a few characters and be like, oh yeah, I know that one. Oh yeah, I know that one. But then once you look at enough characters, like, oh wait, that's not what it's saying. This character has multiple readings and it's actually that word. So then you have to go back and revise. Oh, it's not that reading, it's this reading. It's not that word, it's this word. And to become truly fluent in your reading, you have to be able to do that quite quickly.
Yeah, they were giving some examples of sentences that could be parsed differently based on the context. That's just one of those things that takes additional brain power. And so when we're talking about learning the language, I don't think that that's something that we always think about. It's just like, yeah, you just got to recognize them. But that's another thing that kind of slows down our reading speed and learning to read, is that additional task of having to learn how to parse the characters.
Yeah, and you just got to do it. And reading a lot is a good way to practice it. But one of the interesting things about this paper is the pedagogical implications. So what should we actually do to improve our reading fluency? And one of the things that they recommended is super easy. It's simply reading aloud.
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting point too, because there is kind of a school of thought that's against reading out loud. And one of those criticisms is reading aloud, they think it's only good for just memorization, but it's not really helpful for reading comprehension. And the reason being is because it says reading out loud, it requires you to not just read, but also requires you to speak. And it requires more brain power to do that than just silent reading. And so the idea is that if you're using more brain power just to read out loud, that frees up less brain power to maybe comprehend what you're reading, or to maybe pick up and solidify new words and characters.
Right, but the authors of this paper kind of refute that. They say, for beginning readers, as their word recognition rate has not reached the threshold of automaticity, it would be difficult to free up cognitive resources for higher level linguistic processing.
So translate that for us.
In other words, you're not there yet anyway, so it's good practice. The authors, they recognize that this whole reading aloud thing seems really traditional, and a lot of people have been saying for a while that that's a backwards approach. But they're saying that no, actually, it could be good. And here's why, which is quite interesting. When we read, especially when we're first learning to read, you see the letters and then your brain is like, oh, I know that word. It's this. And then you hear it. So you start out probably by reading it aloud, and then it goes into, mental. You hear it in your mind. Now with Chinese, you see the forms, but then you still go from the forms to the sound, and then from the sound to the meaning, just like you do in English. Now, a lot of people think, oh, Chinese is not, it's not a phonetic alphabet or whatever, like some languages. So you don't actually have to go to the sound. And by skipping the sound, you can read faster. Well, a lot of linguists are saying, no, you can't. That's not possible. Writing systems need to map to the sound, and then from the sound to the meaning. And if you want to become more fluent and a faster reader, you can do that faster, but you can't just skip it. Or you can, but it's not going to work very well. So what they're saying is, do read aloud, because you need to practice mapping the characters to the sounds. And then over time, you're going to get faster and faster, and you'll become a more fluent reader.
I believe this is true. I had once met a guy, I forget where he grew up, but when he was very young, he was in a Chinese school. And so he learned a lot of characters, but then he left at a young age, and he's now grown, and he's largely lost his Chinese. But the interesting thing is that a lot of the meanings of the characters stood with him. And so I had met him at this event, and we were chatting. And so I showed him one of our books. I showed him, our Sherlock Holmes book. And he looked through it, and he could understand multiple sentences which were going on in there, but he could not pronounce them. He couldn't read it. When I read this part in the report, it brought to mind this guy I had met. Backing up what you said, is that the researchers here are saying is that we need to know the pronunciation of a character to really have reading comprehension. So it's not, you can't, and so that's an instance of where a guy where he knew a character and he knew the meaning, but not the pronunciation. And so his overall comprehension of what was going on was really low. It was just sentences and phrases he could pull out of it. But if you are actually able to know the character, know the pronunciation, and know the meaning, of course, then it allows you to make sense of the whole language and have a high level of comprehension.
Right. And I don't think it's impossible to go straight from the forms, to the meaning, but it's definitely not optimal. And as a learner who also wants to be able to converse in Chinese, like going from form to sound to meaning is not a bad way to go. So you might as well practice it.
This also brings up a reason why I do have a little bit of issue with there are some materials I've seen out there which they will show you the character and they have it like even a cartoon thing, built around the character to say, oh, this is like a horse, but they don't teach you the pronunciation. So you're just kind of like, oh no, right off, that's a horse. Now, maybe that's good, like a very good first step, but it's not a sustainable method of learning characters because we need to know the pronunciation of the character to really build comprehension of the language as a whole.
Yeah, and one other little thing that I'd like to mention here, even though it wasn't in the paper, some people see Chinese characters as like the essence of the Chinese language or something like that. And from a linguistic perspective, that's just false. Languages are always spoken first, and writing is a technology. Now, once that written system becomes established and people become literacy, then it can totally transform society and have far-ranging implications. But still, the spoken language is primary, and the written word ties into that.
I thought another interesting thing that they brought up about reason to read out loud, and if you're in a classroom setting or if you're the tutor or teacher, it was a good point that allows an instructor to observe a student's expressions and even errors. Oh, maybe you're pronouncing it wrong, or maybe you had the wrong sound associated with that character. So in an instruction environment allows perhaps a little more help to the student.
Oh, and I should mention that I personally have always found this pretty painful, reading stuff aloud. I've never been a fan, but I've also recognized that it really does help. So I don't know, maybe practice it a bit, try to learn not to hate it because it helps.
A big takeaway that I got from this paper was the importance of reading speed. And in fact, it was found that the most important factor leading to comprehension of a text was your reading speed. The accuracy was very important. So obviously, if you don't know the character, your speed's going to be lower. But it was one of these things like if you know the character, then you're able to recall it quickly, then you're able to read more quickly. The more quickly you're able to read, the better you can comprehend the whole passage.
Right. And I should point out really quickly that don't misunderstand Jared. He's saying there's a good positive correlation, not causation. So, obviously, if you know your characters really well, you can read them quickly, then your overall level is very likely to be much higher, and you're going to comprehend what you're reading.
What I want to pull out about this is that sometimes I've met some people and they're like, yeah, I know like 2,000 characters. Okay, great. That's good. But, how quickly can we recall those? Like you just see the character and boom, you know it right away. That's important. Because, if you see a character and it takes like, 2-3 seconds, then, oh, I know it. Now, that's great. You know it, and it's better than not knowing it. But the point is that you're going to need to build the speed of recall. I think one of the best ways to build that speed of recall is by reading. And reading speed is an excellent gauge of comprehension and of progress in the language.
Right. So if you're one of those people that likes flashcards and you like to go through your flashcard deck, that's not bad, but it's just like one small step. And also if, like Jared is saying, all these characters, but it takes you a second or two to recognize them. That's not enough. And if you're neglecting the basic characters and you're still really slow with them, instead going for the more difficult characters, just so you can say you know more characters, then your fluency is not going up.
And this is something I talk about to people all the time. They're like saying, how do I know, if I'm making, some good progress, or how do I know, especially when, we always talk about reading, how do I know if I'm ready to move to a higher level? And I say, your reading speed alone was one of the best indicators of when you're ready to move to that next level. Now, reading speed is also interesting. It's not in this study, but I've read other papers, and this is in second language education, but even just first language education, like just English, is that reading speed also correlates with test scores. Now, one of the reasons being is that the better you can read, usually the higher your comprehension is. In fact, that's what the research shows. I mean, that makes sense because if you're reading very slow, like 40 words a minute, you're probably not recalling it very well. You don't understand the language very well to read quickly, and so your comprehension is a little bit lower. So the more quickly you can read, the higher comprehension is. But when you get into test situations, it's a little more pronounced because you have a question and you have to read the question, and then you have to read the possible answers. Now, let's just assume it's a multiple choice test. And let's say it takes a slow reader 1 minute to read the question, to understand it, and to understand the answers. And so now after 1 minute, you now be able to think about what your response is. But if you're a quick reader and maybe it takes you 30 seconds to read it, and you maybe as you're reading, you instantly understand what the question is. So if you just even look at that alone, you're going to score higher on a test than someone who's reading more slowly. And tests are usually timed. And so being able to read at a more quicker speed is really beneficial. It does correlate with higher test scores in general. But it is good to note that they cite here that there's a threshold for reading speed, that after you get past a threshold, that, increased reading speed doesn't help you further with comprehension. And that makes sense. Let's say you're reading, 200 words a minute, and that'd be a good speed in Chinese. If you progress 400, then 600, 800, 1,000, you get into speed reading. There's at some point your speed gets so fast, or you're reading so fast that, your comprehension is actually going to begin to suffer. So it's just what it's saying here is that, hitting a certain threshold is going to really help your Chinese. They don't actually cite what that threshold is. Based on the research I've seen for English learning English as a second language, they cite that threshold for maybe an intermediate learner is about 120 to 150 words a minute. So Chinese, maybe it's around there too.
I think for most of us, it's pretty safe to just focus on comprehensible stuff that you can read without a dictionary and just read more and get the speed up. I don't think too many of us are in the reading speed range where we're worried about going a whole lot faster and not getting increased comprehension out of it.
Yeah, that's a good problem to have, though, if you ever get there.
Good problem that no one has. Okay, so one other thing I mentioned already, that one of the pedagogical implications is that reading aloud is helpful for learners, in the opinion of the authors. And then another thing they said was quite helpful is repeated reading. So you've read it before, and you go back and you read it again, and then you do a lot better, and this helps increase fluency.
Yeah, a direct quote from the paper says, numerous studies have shown that repeated reading improves reading speed, word recognition accuracy, and reading comprehension, as well as facilitating growth in language knowledge.
All right, this isn't too shocking. Read stuff, especially if it's difficult the first time, reading it again, you're going to have increased fluency there, and also increased confidence.
And I think it brings out the idea here of even sometimes, maybe trying to memorize some of the things that you're reading. And that's, it makes sense a little bit. Grammar is patterns. And so you're reading even the same thing over and over again. You start to see some of those patterns. Maybe they may imprint in your mind a little bit better.
I actually have a client who has a really good memory, and he's been working on improving his reading fluency. And so we've done this repeated reading practice. Both on the readings that he's working on now and the ones that he's worked on in the past. And one of the things we have to be careful of is his memory is so good that when we go back to an old reading, he can apparently read it really well. It's like, wow, your fluency is so much better now. But no, actually he memorized a lot of it just without even trying. And so if you give one of those old readings and you just change a few keywords here and there, like really obvious changes, he'll read them wrong because he's reciting it from memory, maybe without even doing it on purpose. So to really improve your reading fluency, you wanna be able to read stuff that you haven't seen before. So memorizing everything helps in some ways, but it's not going to help you with unfamiliar texts. But to be able to reread to the point that you have increased fluency, and maybe not quite to the point where you're memorizing it, that's still going to be really helpful.
Yeah, I definitely think there's a line. I remember when you had the interview, John, on episode 8 with Dr. David Moser. He did xiangsheng on stage, and it's a comedy style, and so from his acts, he took different phrases and things that he had memorized and used them in everyday conversation, and it worked pretty well for him at different points. I was honestly, I've never been a big proponent of memorizing things, but I thought it was this is kind of interesting, that I think it has its place, and I think that's one of the things. There's a lot of these things that have their place. Even flashcards have their place, even though I'm not a big proponent of them. And I think it's a good point of, hey, maybe there is some benefit in doing it, but maybe not as the core learning method.
But also keep in mind that Dr. Moser was talking about xiangsheng, which is an oral performance, right? Whereas when you're reading, a lot of it is not meant to be spoken. So it's not necessarily going to be something that you want to memorize in order to say. In fact, you might come across as really weird if you start doing that. But if some of the things that you're reading have a lot of dialogue and you can remember lines from dialogues, then that for sure could carry over into your spoken Chinese.
Yeah, I guess it really depends on what are you reading. Ultimately, the conclusion of this paper was that reading fluency is really comprised of being able to accurately recall the characters, your reading speed, and all these things really contribute to your reading comprehension, and that this is really important. So you need to focus on your accuracy of your characters, being able to read quickly, and be able to parse that language. And that really happens with, more experience with the language. So it's kind of like the more you read at a comprehensible level, the better you're going to get at reading. Bottom line.
So the paper is basically saying practice makes perfect.
All right, now we got a word from our sponsor, and our sponsor is Mandarin Companion.
All right.
Now, John, we just released something this week.
Yeah, so this new breakthrough level graded reader is called The Misadventures of Zhou Haisheng, and it uses only 150 characters. People are buying it and reading it already, and so far people are liking it.
Yeah, this is a really big deal because as far as anything that's of significant length, that's written using only 150 characters that are simple enough for an elementary learner to read. I mean, there's just not stuff out there. There's some other readers with maybe 150 words, but it's not easy words, not easy characters that they're using in their books. So go out there and check it out. You can get it on Amazon. You can find it on MandarinCompanion.com.
Yeah, we have a sample on our website, right?
We do.
So you can get a little feel for exactly how accessible only 150 simple characters really is.
Yeah, so go out there, check it out, and if it's at your level, get a copy and start reading. All right, moving on to rants and raves. I think, John, I'm going to start out. I'm going to start out with a rave.
All right.
My rave is about a book. It's another graded reader. It's not one of ours. When I was at the National Chinese Language Conference, I was next to these other guys, and they have published a series of books. Their series is based off of Journey to the West. So it has the stories of the Monkey King. And for anyone who wants to look for this, the first book is called The Rise of the Monkey King. And it's the book one of a 6-book series that they have. Now, their books are written at a HSK 3 level. And so it's based on the 600 words on the HSK 3 level. Now, it's not the most simple book. If it was compared to our series, it might, if we had like a level 4 or maybe a level 5, it would fit into there. So if you're like an upper intermediate level learner, it would probably be more appropriate for you. It says HSK 3. I think it's still a little bit harder than that because there was a lot of words like, I remember I opened up as like poo-poo, like a waterfall, So those are some not very common characters you're going to have. So there was a lot of things like that. But the format of the book, it had Chinese on the right side. On the left side, it had the pinyin. So the pinyin wasn't over the Chinese. I'm still not a big fan of the pinyin on the left side type thing, but it's there. And then there was an English summary in the back of each chapter, which it's also a dubious thing. But overall,
so many backhanded compliments.
I'm sorry, but people are always asking, like saying, "Hey, I need something harder." That maybe the native level texts are still just too hard for me, but I still need something harder than maybe your guys' level 2 or even some of the other things out there. So this is a great series. There's 6 books in the series. As I said, the first book is called Rise of the Monkey King, and the authors are Jeff Pepper and Xiaohui Wang. So we'll put a link to that on our show notes, and you guys can check that out if you need some higher level graded readers.
Also, I have a client who has read at least one of those books, and he really likes it. He's an intermediate learner. He listens to intermediate level on Chinese Pod. He's read our level 1 and 2 graded readers, and he can handle it, and he likes it. So shout out to James. I've heard good things about that book.
Great. I tested it out with some students that I've been working with at a 7th grade Chinese dual immersion, and some of the advanced students who could read it, they really enjoyed the story. So yeah, it's great. Go out there and get it.
All right, so now my rave. I have a rave today. I thought it would be fun to bring up a Chinese movie that I really enjoyed. This is probably the first Chinese movie where I felt like I could understand most of the Chinese, and I watched it quite a while ago. The movie came out in 1998. It is one of the classic Feng Xiaogang movies. That's the director. And it's called 不见不散. The English name is actually a really bad translation, but anyway, the English name is Be There or Be Square. 不见不散 actually means if we don't meet, don't disperse, like wait at the meeting place until we both arrive, no matter what. That's what it means. It doesn't mean be there or be square. But anyway, it's a cute story. It's about some Chinese couple that kind of moved to the States. So you have some English, which is kind of helpful when you're having trouble understanding Chinese. But there's a lot of quite simple Chinese. I haven't seen this movie in a long time, but I just remember when I saw it, this was, I don't know, 2002 or 3 probably. I found it quite accessible.
That's great. I'll actually have to check that out then.
And it stars Ge You, who's a great actor. He's been in a lot of movies. You know who I'm talking about?
No, maybe if I saw his picture, I might know who he is.
You would definitely know this guy. He was in, Let the Bullets Fly. He was in To Live, Huoja. He was in Farewell My Concubine. He was in Shouji. He's just been in a ton of Da War. He's been in a ton of famous Chinese movies.
Oh, wasn't he in that movie Be There or Be Square?
He was.
Oh, that guy. Okay, yeah. I know who he is.
He's great. He is great. Recommended.
I'm from Poland.
That's our guest, Ola. She had to help me out a little bit to say her name properly.
Ola Jagielska.
So Ola
Jagielska.
Jagielska?
Jagielska.
It's a Y. Jagielska.
It's a Y, yeah. It's a Y. Jagielska.
Ola
It's
Jagielska.
like a Y. Yeah, pretty good.
Okay, all right. I need to start learning Polish now. Ola is a native speaker of Polish and has learned English, Korean, and, of course, Chinese.
At the moment, I'm in Hanoi, in Vietnam.
Ola and her husband, who is from Manchester, England, live what they call a nomadic lifestyle, moving to a new country every few years. We had the chance to have a chat about their travels and her experience with learning Chinese and other languages. Stay with us. So I know you have a website. It's called Being a Nomad. Tell me a little bit about what brought you along this path and what you're doing right now.
Well, the way it happened was actually a bit funny because at the beginning, when I was younger, I really wanted to be a scientist. But I realized that it's a little bit too, well, maybe not lonely, but you have to do most of work on your own. So I decided it's not for me. At some point, I decided, okay, so maybe it would be a good idea to go to England for the summer. I went to London for the summer and I stayed for 5 years. And that's where I decided to study English. At the time, I didn't feel I was very good at learning languages. But after I actually discovered flashcards, that's what got me really into learning languages.
Oh, flashcards. How did that get you into learning languages?
Well, no, it's more that it showed me that I can. Because, I was studying English and I had problems with remembering a lot of vocabulary. Just learning from lists, for me, it was a nightmare. I just couldn't get it. And then I started using flashcards and I said wow, I can remember it. Finally, I can remember all those words. And then at my university, they had an option for Spanish as well. So it's okay, let's try Spanish now. And this also, then I saw it's really not that as difficult as I thought. I was still at university and I was working as a waitress at the time. And I just wanted something else. So I always liked teaching. My mom is a teacher as well. So I thought, okay, it would be good to do a course to teach English. And that's where I met my husband.
In college?
During the CELTA course. This is the course to teach English as a second language.
Oh, okay, yes.
It was still in London. And he was thinking about going to Korea. So at first, we just started dating, and he was okay, I'm going to Korea. So at the beginning, it was a bit, okay, what to do? Then we were just okay, let's see what happens. And I went to visit him for a month. I stayed in Korea for a month. I went back home for a few weeks and then started okay, let's try it. So when I was in Korea, I was okay, so I should probably start learning Korean.
Mm-hmm.
I picked up some Korean during that time. Then we got back to England for a year. After that, we moved to Poland for 2 years. We actually stayed in my hometown.
Oh, what did you do there?
I was teaching English. And after 2 years, we started getting a bit restless and decided, okay, we need to go somewhere. And we went to China.
Why did you decide to go to China?
Mostly because it seemed like a good place to find a job for both of us. And, well, of course, I was always curious about China. It's one of those countries that you always hear about and you would like to see.
So at this point, you've taken a lot of time to learn English. You've been learning Spanish, some Korean, and now you're like, hey, let's go to China. So I can see now it's probably not much of a leap to say, okay, now I'm going to learn Chinese.
Yeah, well, the thing is, when you are in a place, then it's better to start learning a language. Of course, despite what a lot of people say, it is possible to live in China without knowing much Chinese.
Yes, I agree. I've known people in there who've been there 20 years and still don't speak Chinese.
Yeah, exactly. It's not necessary, but on the other hand, it's a great opportunity. It's like, okay, I'm here. I can try it. So we lived there for 3 years.
When you were in China, what city were you in?
First 2 years I was in Putian, which is a small city in Fujian province. And after that, I was in Xiamen, which was like 1 hour south from Putian.
So at that stage, you've lived in a bunch of different places around the world already.
Yeah, I did.
What was it like moving to China and to these smaller towns?
Well, it wasn't really that small. It still had I think at least 3 million citizens. So it wasn't that small. And the good thing was that we had a good support from our school. So it was really nice. But of course, we still felt a bit lost when we arrived. And, everything is in Chinese characters, which we didn't know. Last month before moving, I started studying some Chinese, but, well, you can't learn much during that time. But the thing I really liked about living in a smaller city, because I moved to Xiamen, which is quite a big city after, is that people are actually much more, interested in you, also Chinese people. So it's much easier to actually try to talk to them, especially once I started speaking some Chinese.
Well, that's great. I think overall, Chinese people are very friendly. And so that's good to hear that you had a good experience down there with that. What stage did you start learning, studying Chinese in earnest?
I think it wasn't till 1.5 years after I was there, because before I was studying, but it was on and off. So I had first year I had just language exchanges, which are a good idea, but now in my experience, they are better if you are at least intermediate level, because otherwise you just try to fall back too much on other language, in this case, English. And I think it was after my operation, after I was fine, I basically...
Well, back up a little bit. You said you had an operation, or you said a medical experience where you're like, I need to learn Chinese. What happened in that experience that prompted that decision?
What I mean is, I had cancer. For everybody, when something like this happens to you, you just realize you have thoughts like, what am I doing with my life? And things like that. And then I realized I've been studying Chinese for 1.5 years, and all I can do is a simple exchange only. So I thought I must do something more if I want to do anything with it. Have you ever heard about Add One Challenge?
Add One Challenge? No, I haven't heard of that.
Add One Challenge.
Tell me about it.
There is this book, Fluent in 3 months, by Benny Lewis. And this was originally based on his idea that you can get to, maybe not conversational level, but you can have a conversation with native speakers after 3 months of studying a language. There was this guy, Brian, who created a challenge out of that, which was basically 90 days. We were recording videos every month of ourselves speaking Chinese, and the last one had to be 15 minutes speaking Chinese, talking in Chinese to a native speaker.
How did it go for you?
Actually, really good. I think because I already did have some background, so it probably seemed easier because of that. No, but I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed making video as well. No, I think I really learned a lot during that time.
What did you do to start learning Chinese at this stage? Because, I mean, it's great you have like kind of that book, you had that challenge, but what were you actually doing to help yourself progress along the language?
I had a textbook, I was studying from. I had 2 lessons a week with a Chinese teacher. Although they were 2 different teachers at different days, they were both of them. They were not really a professional, Chinese as a second language teachers. One of them was a Chinese teacher, but like literature Chinese teacher.
Yeah. So this is a teacher that's teaching, I guess, Chinese in a local school?
Yeah, she was teaching at university.
Oh, okay. So this is usually difference between first and second language learning teaching.
Yeah, but I think she was still helping. It was still helping me a lot, obviously, because it was helping me to speak. I was going through my textbook. I was using all the time. I was using flashcards, but the way I'm using it, I use it to learn sentences, not words.
Okay, so talk about that a little bit, about how are you using them to learn sentences?
What I would do, because in a book I would always have a dialogue, so I was putting in my flashcards, I would put the whole sentence from a dialogue so I can translate it from Polish into Chinese. That's how I would always do that. At the beginning, I was writing letters in pinyin and then number of the tone, which really helped at the beginning. I must say that Chinese tones in general is something that I think struggled with the most always.
Yes, they are a very challenging aspect of the language.
Yeah, they are. Although I think Vietnamese is worse. But I also was using this app Scritter for learning Chinese characters.
Yeah, Scritter. We just had their CEO, Jake Gill, on our show a couple episodes ago.
Yeah, I really like this app because it's really good for practicing writing. And feels a bit like a game. Will I get it right? Will I not get it right? So that's one of the reasons I really liked it. And with this, I found that I was learning Chinese characters much faster than I would in any other way.
Now, why was that? Was it because you were actually writing out the character?
I think it was because I was writing. I think it was because I was doing it manually. Even if I was doing this on my phone with a finger, it's still, it's muscle memory. You basically remember it better. Although definitely, I know that if I tried writing some Chinese by hand, I also found it helpful. So I did a mixture. I would also try to write some things by hand as well.
So at this point, you have a textbook, you have 2 teachers, you're coming once a week on different days, and you're also using Scritter, and you're writing some characters out. So tell me about how did your Chinese progress during this time, and where do you feel like you started making some breakthroughs and some real progress with learning the language?
For me, really, the point was that when I actually realized that I can have a pretty long conversation, I started preparing for HSK3.
So HSK3, that's the Chinese language test, the 3rd level of it. You made a decision then to prepare to take that test. Why did you decide to take that test?
I just thought that it would be a good way to measure my progress. And what's more, I will have something out of it. So I thought it would be a good idea just to, let's try to see if I can do it. But also I generally think that exams are a good way of measuring your progress.
Can you talk about any times where you feel like you really made a breakthrough with Chinese, like where you said, like, oh, wow, you had an experience where it was like, yeah, I really used the language, or all of a sudden something just started making sense?
I think it was one day I had to get to the train station really early in the morning, and my friend was supposed to call me Didi, which is like Uber in China. But I think she overslept, so she didn't call. I was waiting on a bus stop and some guy just randomly stopped, and he was actually a DD driver. And we started talking, and he said he can take me to the train station, which was quite a while away. But then I was really surprised that by then, I actually can communicate. It's actually not that difficult to talk to a Chinese person, even without any help. So I think that was one of those situations.
So it was that ability to communicate where you wanted to go, and the person understood you, right?
Well, yeah, and after, because it was like pretty far. Train station was pretty far. So we actually started chatting what I'm doing in China and things like that. So we actually managed to have, semi-decent conversation.
Wow. So it was more than just saying, oh, I want to go here. It was like you had a situation you had to resolve.
Yeah, this is when you really find out if you know the language, when you have a problem and you need to solve it.
So now, Ola, you've learned some other languages too. How would you compare your experience learning Chinese to learning, per se, English or Spanish or even Korean?
Well, it was pretty much different each time, because I'm learning how to learn a language as well. And I think with Chinese, first of all, English was the language I made the most mistakes with. And that's why it took the longest time. But Chinese, everybody was always saying that the worst thing about Chinese is characters, learning the characters. But for me, it never was the most difficult part. For me, it was always the tones. Tones were always, for me, very, very tricky. Very tricky to really master them.
You said you made some mistakes when you were learning English. What were some of the mistakes you made, and how did you change how you learned when it came to Chinese?
Well, one of the most important mistakes, it wasn't that much my mistake as my teachers, that I wasn't taught the pronunciation properly. The problem is that the way English is taught in most countries, teachers don't seem to care too much that, for example, some sounds in English that are in English don't exist in Polish. So, for example, when I started learning English, I would never say, I couldn't pronounce the TH sound, like th, because we just don't have it in Polish. It wasn't until I was 26 when I found out, there are a lot of sounds in English that I didn't know existed. Which was a bit of a challenge. So that's why when I started learning Chinese, I remember that I really wanted to make sure that I pronounce all the sounds properly. Here, I must say that Polish helped me a bit, because there are Polish and Chinese have some sounds in common. Some sounds are similar.
Okay. Like, what are some of those similarities?
Like a kind of sh and xi, we have very similar distinction in Polish. They are a bit different, but they are similar enough that I could use pretty much really close to the Polish ones and be understood without problems. Whereas I know that a lot of English native speakers have problems with this in Chinese, because those sounds are just so similar for them.
Oh, that's interesting. Now, I'm curious about what the market's like there in Poland. Are there Chinese learning materials in Polish that are like Polish Chinese?
To be honest, I haven't used any. I know that there are some, but as I said, I never used them.
A lot of times it seems like a lot of the Chinese learners that I've met in China who are from Europe, they also speak English, and a lot of times all of their Chinese learning is actually English Chinese as opposed to Polish Chinese.
It's kind of you need to do that. Well, there are many more materials in English as well. Because of some similarities between Polish and Chinese, I know that in a way it would have been easier for me to learn it through Polish, but my teachers didn't speak any Polish, so this wasn't an option.
If you could go back in time and give yourself some advice when you first started learning Chinese, what would you say?
Well, I definitely will say at the beginning, first of all, don't be scared of characters. Start learning them as soon as possible. Listen a lot. This was something that I didn't do enough at the beginning, I think. So listen a lot to Chinese, as much as you can, because this really helps. And try to speak as much as possible. Well, maybe put yourself in a situation when you have to speak Chinese, especially if you live in China, because then it's easier, obviously.
Well, Ola, you said something about learning characters. How important has learning Chinese characters been to your whole learning experience of learning Chinese?
I think actually very important. I think that learning characters really help me remember vocabulary. I remember words better when I see them as characters. Also because, for sure there are some characters that have exactly the same meaning. But because I know the characters, I can distinguish them. So I know they are different words.
What are some of the things that helped you build your literacy and build your character recognition in Chinese?
Well, one of the things I started using at some point was Mandarin Companion, which those are books that are written in easier Chinese.
Yeah, I think I know a little bit about those.
Really, do you? Well, maybe not surprising. Even that there were some stories that I knew already, I still really got into them. I still really wanted to read, okay, what's going to happen next? What exactly happened here? I do sometimes like rereading books in general. I obviously understood enough to carry on, which was really nice. I find it's like, okay, I'm reading something and I understand. Okay, I don't understand every single character, but I understand what the story is about. I understand what is happening.
And how did that impact your Chinese?
I think it helped me a little bit with fluency. With my friend at the time, we would talk a little bit about the books that I read. The thing is that because I didn't try to read it out loud. So it was more that I had more exposure to how sentences are built, which I think is important in learning any language.
So I guess you learned a lot of grammar from it then.
Yeah, Chinese grammar is, specific, for the lack of the better word. So yeah, I definitely learned quite a lot of grammar. I generally like reading books when I learn a language. In Spanish, I read a lot, same as in English. And that's why I was really happy that I found something I can read Chinese in, because, if I take a newspaper, it's like I still wasn't able to understand enough.
I guess one other thing is that you mentioned that, right now you're living in Vietnam, you're in Hanoi. This is something that when I talk to different learners, and a lot of times this gets brought up of that, there's Chinese people all over the world, and you tend to encounter people in different cities. I had one of our last guests, he talked about how he was in France and in Paris, and he went to a local Chinese restaurant for some directions, and he spoke to them in Chinese. How often do you have that opportunity to, meet or interact with Chinese people, even there in Vietnam? Or have you had any other connections where you've had someone who speaks Chinese and you were able to connect with them on a different level?
I once met one. Actually, it was a Vietnamese. It was a Vietnamese person, but he was a Chinese teacher, and he didn't speak English very well. So we had a chat in Chinese.
What was that like?
No, it was really nice. I was still okay. It's always a really nice thing to do, to be able, to speak to somebody I wouldn't be able to speak to normally, because we wouldn't have a language in common. We wouldn't be able to communicate. And for me, that's what learning languages is all about, to communicate with somebody I otherwise wouldn't be able to communicate with.
Well, that's great. Well, Ola, this all been really interesting, and it's great to hear your perspective, especially most of the people we've interviewed for our show, they are, native English speakers learning Chinese, but your experience is very different, and I think that's given us a good perspective. Now, Ola, tell me, last thing here is just you have a website too. It's called beinganomad.com. And on that website, I guess you catalog your experience of being a nomad and learning different languages.
Yeah, well, it's the blog is my husband's and mine, so it's kind of travel language blog where my husband usually writes about travel, mostly writes about travel. I write a bit more about learning languages, and here we also write about kind of living kind of a nomadic life. We don't move that often really. We usually, when we are in a place, we stay there at least 2 years, but yeah, probably not longer. But I found it really actually motivating using the the blog as well. I think it helps me with learning languages a bit as well.
Well, it sounds like your story has still yet to be written. And so looking forward to the next chapter in your guys' book. You have been listening to the You Can Learn Chinese podcast. Help us spread the word by sharing this with your friends, classmates, teachers, cousins, painter, chemist, vet, surfer, stuntman, architect, accountant, translator, marine biologist, and that one guy named Miles. You can subscribe on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. And please write us a review so we know how we're doing. You can find us on Facebook and at mandarincompanion.com. Apologies to Mark Zuckerberg. We just ran out of time. The You Can Learn Chinese podcast is produced by myself, Jared Turner. I'd like to thank Ola Jagielska and my co-host, the man, the myth, the legend, John Pasden. See you next time.